My name is Jack Keller. I'm a music lawyer in Nashville, Tennessee. I have my own law firm, Keller, Turner, Andrews, and Ganem. And my father, Jack Keller, was one of the pioneer rock and roll songwriters of the 1950s and 1960s. And his catalog is administered through Downtown Music Publishing. And I've been working with them for many years and brought the catalog over because I knew that it would be a very interesting and unique piece of the Downtown Music catalog because it had those 1950s and 60s gems that you might not have in every catalog. So it was fun to rediscover the songs with the Downtown team as I brought them over, and had to talk to them about them, share the music and some of the stories around my father. So he started writing in New York City in the Brill Building, as we call it. He was a songwriter that started in the 1950s. 1955 was the first year that he seriously worked as a songwriter. His father was a band leader, did weddings, bar mitzvahs, and those sort of things. So my father grew up around a musical family, had to learn the piano and the accordion and those sort of things, and so found out that he had a bug for writing music. And he worked, I believe, in a tailor shop in Brooklyn, New York, and during his lunch hour, he would sneak away to go down to Manhattan, and he would go to the Brill Building, and he would sell his songs. One of the funny things about the time was that you could go in the building, and there were numerous publishers in that building at the time, and you would just go up to the doors, and you'd knock on the door. They'd answer the door and say, I have a song. And they would come in and you'd hand them the sheet music. They would take it into another room where there was a guy sitting at the piano. He would play it. And the publisher would listen and say, not for me. And then you'd go to the next door. You'd knock on that door and you'd play the same song. And my father would do that and work his way down the hallway. But if a song worked, they would say, this is great. Perry Como will be recording it. And like within 2 days, they were in the studio. They were recording the song. Within another week, it was on the radio. And that was the speed in which the music industry worked back then. So my father began to have some songs that were placed. They weren't necessarily number one songs yet, but it was easier because there were so many artists looking for material and all these publishers in the Brill Building that he had songs that started to be out there. He met up with a songwriter who was older than him, who had more experience, named Noel Sherman. The two of them, he taught my father the craft, honed the craft, and they wrote together for 1955 to 1957. And that's when my father had a lot of recordings with Nat King Cole, with Perry Como. They were, songs that I'm really proud of now, but at the time, you were, getting these cuts, and these were artists that we now look back at as icons, and it was easier to get a cut back then, but he would have these. So when I look at his discography, it's always amazing to look at the recording artists from 55 to 57, Peggy Lee, Nat King Cole, Perry Como, and all of them. Then in 1957, he had his first top 10 song with the Chordettes called Just Between You and Me. A lot of people know Mr. Sandman and Lollipop. Just Between You and Me is their third biggest hit. It was top 10, and that was it. At that point, my father had finally, he had the song that broke into the top 10. He remembers getting into his convertible Thunderbird, driving around Brooklyn all night long, because at that point, when you were in heavy rotation, that song played every hour. And so he would just drive around to listen to his song playing on the radio. That was to him an amazing place at that point in his life. So in 1957, he really becomes an established songwriter, has a top 10 song. From 57 to 1959, continues writing, having success, and everything changes in 1959. Up to that point, songwriters signed what we call in the industry single song agreements. So when a songwriter would pitch to those publishers, knock on the door, they would sign a contract for that one song. It would have publishing rights, it would have reversion rights, and those sort of things. In 1959, an experiment began with Don Kirshner, who most people know about from his involvement in rock and roll, and his partner Al Nevins formed a publishing company called Aldon Music. For the first time ever, their idea was, what if we sign songwriters to exclusive contracts where they just write for us? That way, they're not knocking on every door, they're just writing for us. And at that time, they only had 2 writers signed, Howard Greenfield, who was one of the great lyricists of rock and roll, and his discography is amazing for all the songs that he's written with everyone that he's written with, and Neil Sedaka, who was his co-writer, music writer, and also an artist. So they had signed Howie and Neil, and they were beginning to record music. They were looking for a seasoned songwriter. They were looking for somebody who had experience in producing, in writing, in being able to bring a little more gravitas. So my father was connected with them, and they signed him as the 3rd songwriter to Aldon Music. At that time, Neil Sedaka was recording Calendar Girl, Happy Birthday, Sweet 16, Oh Carol, Calendar Girl, all those songs. And my father was allowed to produce with Al Nevins, who was the producer. Don Kirshner was the talent finder and sort of the guy who motivated everybody and was definitely the salesman. And Al Nevins was the business guy, but more of the producer. And Al took my father under his wing, and they were in there producing Calendar Girl, Happy Birthday, Sweet 16, all of those songs. And my father was also playing on them. So when we used to talk about, when we listen to songs, he goes, that's me on the piano, or in this, my father played the piano in Locomotion, so he still gets residuals from that. And he was, at that time, the studios were much more simple. You had 4 tracks, sometimes you had 2 tracks. And so you really couldn't do what you can do today. And so my father would be at the console. And so in Calendar Girl, there's a riff where in between the choruses and the verses, there's a drum that goes brum, brum, brum. And my father said I had to stand there and be ready to go up, down, because you couldn't edit it later on. And I was doing the claps, in the songs. We were all in there doing that. And it was a team effort, but he was making music. He was creating some of the iconic rock and roll songs as a producer. At that point, Neil Sedaka became very famous as an artist, and because of that, he had to go out on the road. When he went out on the road, Howie Greenfield is writing lyrics and doesn't have anyone to write with. So at that point, he says to my father, he says, hey, let's write together. And so he would write with Neil kind of remotely and 2 days a week, and he would write with my father 2 days a week. And this is when everything for my father really took a turn for the positive for his career, was that Connie Francis, who was looking for some rock and roll songs. She had been singing much more traditional music, the Frank Sinatra type music, and her father, manager, was trying to change her into seeing what she could do in rock and roll. And by rock and roll, it was not hard rock, but it was definitely changing over to that sort of style. And so the 2 of them wrote a song together called Everybody's Somebody's Fool. Connie Francis records it, it releases, and it goes #1. It's a #1 song for Connie Francis. It's the first time a female artist has, I believe at that time, had a #1 song. And that becomes this big deal. And the follow-up song that they write for Connie Francis, because that was the whole thing, let's get in and do it again, was a song called My Heart Has a Mind of Its Own. Recorded, it went #1. So now he has back-to-back #1s with Connie Francis. Nobody's ever done that before with a female artist. It's a big deal. And so he has cemented himself into the sort of, at that time, the elite group of rock and roll songwriters. The other writer that my father would write with, so he had 2 days a week with Howie, and then the other 2 days a week was with Jerry Goffin. And most people know who Jerry Goffin is because Jerry Goffin and Carole King were married and wrote songs together. At that time, Jerry did not allow Carol to be in the music business. He didn't want her to be. So my father would be at the apartment with Jerry Goffin, and they were writing at that time songs like Run to Him, which was #2 for Bobby V, only because my father says Lion Sleeps Tonight was #1 and it just wouldn't leave. And if it would have, he would have had a #1 with that. But he would always watch the charts and he's like, I couldn't get Lion Sleeps Tonight displaced. But they would write songs like that. And Carol would be in the house and she would be listening to what they were doing. And she would come over to my father, who was working at the piano, and she would ask him questions like, what is that? What are you doing there? And so she was learning from the skill and expertise of my father at that time as a pianist and a songwriter. Obviously, Carole King, as my father always said, is one of the most talented singer-songwriters ever. Her knowledge around music, harmonies, performance, writing is unparalleled. But at that time, she was, just getting ready to break out. And he was part of, I think, the group of people that were around her to help build that creative energy that became Carole King. She would be allowed to sing demonstration recordings. So I have in my catalog a bunch of demos of songs that were recorded by major artists, but demo Carole King. And so it's always fun to hear her voice on these songs from the early 1960s, before she even had her first song that she wrote on the charts, let alone performed. And so I always think that's a really interesting connection, because a lot of people will talk about the Brill Building and Carole King and Jerry Goffin and Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil. Well, there was a larger group of writers. I think that because Carole was a performer, and Neil was a performer, it always gives them a larger spotlight. But my father was there at the time. He was writing. He loved writing. He wrote, every 5 days a week during the work he would write. He was a machine. Songs back then, you get it. I mean, it was Nashville. People come in and do their song, try and write a song a week. I don't know what, 2 songs a week, whatever they do. But he was writing. But what was great was Don Kirshner created, I think, besides creating the first exclusive songwriting contracts with songwriters signed, which is the standard today. There is no single song agreements anymore. Everybody signs to an exclusive publishing deal or administration deal with a publisher. Don Kirshner was great at creating this competition. And we're talking about songwriters who are 16 years old to 22 years old. He would take them out and play stickball in the street. And he'd buy new stickballs and bats, and he'd buy the whole thing, and he'd come out, let's go play, and they'd play. The rooms were all like that really thin material that you would think when you envision these writer rooms back in the 1960s. So you could kind of hear what was going on in each room. My father said I would hear what, Jerry Goffin and Carole King were writing, or Barry Mann, or what, Neil Sedaka, and we would be like inspired by each other. And then at the end of the week, they'd all come together. And Don would say, okay, play me what you wrote. So, Barry Mann, Cynthia Weil are playing You Lost That Loving Feeling, or Carole King and Jerry Goffin are playing, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow? And my father is playing with Howie, Venus in Blue Jeans, and you got Oh Carol with Neil Sedaka. And they would basically play the songs, and they would sort of, well, which one do you think is the go-to? So if you can imagine, I always like to say that I think Paul McCartney and John Lennon were so great because they riffed off each other, and there was just this competition. Could I write a better song than Paul wrote? John wrote a great song, Paul wanted it. And so I think because of that competition, their level of energy toward beating the other people, having the #1 song. And so this was Aldon Music had, but this is all pre-Beatles, remember, they had the charts. The top 20, top 40 was really controlled by Aldon Music. And my father was really lucky to be there. I mean, Phil Spector had his sound, and coming later on, and Motown and all those things, but at this time, Aldon really was the first to cement this control of rock and roll, and they were the feeder for so many artists. And so my father is writing very successfully 1959 to 1964. 1964, the Beatles arrive and change everything. And at that point in time, the amount of songs being recorded by artists that they wrote themselves goes way up. Songs that are taken from songwriters start to go down. And so my father is obviously trying to figure out what his next move is. So the other thing that happens in 1965 is that Don Kirshner and Alan Evans realize they've built this amazing catalog. And so this is the first time in history now that we have a major publisher sell their company. And Screen Gems out in California bought the company. And now that he did that, Screen Gems owned this amazing catalog and they owned the songwriter contracts. So this whole new world opened up that didn't exist before because Screen Gems is now making movies and putting television shows together. So my father makes his first, trips out to California and obviously loves it. But right before that happens, they're saying, okay, we have, so the way they would do a television show is they said, okay, we have this new show. It's about a witch that marries a mortal and they live together. And the show is got a temporary track in there with Frank Sinatra singing Witchcraft. And he would assign Carol and Jerry, Barry and Cynthia, my dad with Howie Greenfield. They'd all go write a version of a theme song and they'd pitch it. And they got to watch the pilot episode. They had to figure that out. And my father landed the TV theme to Bewitched. And of course, you never know whether a show is going to be a hit or not. But obviously, Bewitched is one of the ones in the pantheon of shows that everyone still remembers. And TV themes became this thing that we all joke about, like we all learned TV themes. But this is right at the very beginning. In the mid-'60s is when those television themes become the catchy tunes. My father was really lucky because then became a run. He got Sally Field and Gidget television show, Hazel with Shirley Booth, then Wackiest Ship in the Army and Camp Runamuck. So there's a TV guide I have somewhere in my files that shows that my father had a television theme on every night of the week, Monday to Friday. And I think about how cool that would be today to be like, wow, my dad has 5 television themes out there right now. Mike Post, writes all those television themes, and how great that was for him to have that. So now he's got this foothold. He's got a foothold into the television themes. He's writing for some movies, so he relocates to California. Moves out there in 1965, gets married to my mom, and they move out there. They're living on Sunset Boulevard. And at that point, Screen Gems is putting together a new television show. And this show is going to be based on a band that didn't exist before, but they were going to put them together and make a television show around them. It's called the Monkees. And I remember my father telling me that, Lester Sill, who ran the West Coast office for Screen Gems now, approached my dad. They had Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart already connected to the show, writing music for them. Boyce and Hart were a known writing quantity and an artist, but like 1959, they didn't have the producing experience. They didn't know how to wrangle an artist that had no previous experience performing together. So Lester said, well, Jack, you're out in LA. Why don't you go in and produce with Tommy and Bobby? And so my father did. And it was very interesting because my father felt like this wasn't going to go anywhere because it was very difficult to get them together. He was like, I don't know what this is going to be. And at the time, Screen Gems is rushing the television show out. They hadn't even gotten the band to perform and the theme to the Monkees yet. And so when the show aired, the version that aired until they had a version they could sub in was actually Tommy and Bobby and my father singing the theme to the Monkees as the Monkees. Tommy sounded very much like Mickey Dolenz, and it was very easy for them to do that. So my father produced 6 sides of that album, which at the time, he didn't even try to write a song for the album. That's how little faith he had in the Monkees. So he produced 6 sides on that album, and then it was released. And at that time, it sold 2 million copies out of the gate. Now the Beatles hadn't even done that on an album. And so this was a feat, not repeated until the boy bands. But it was such a hit. And my father remembers he wanted to move to a place called Westlake Village, north of LA. It was a brand new community at the time. And I think a 6-bedroom house there at that time cost $35,000. And boy, I wish I could buy a few of those. So he goes into the office and he's like, "Hey, I need an advance. Is it possible? I know that I might not have enough in the pipeline, but and they're like, "What do you need?" He goes, "I need $35,000." And they hand him a check. He's like, "That was easy." They said, "Your residuals on the 6 sides for producing the Monkees is going to be much more than that." And so, and I can only imagine Tommy and Bobby, who wrote all those songs, just how much wealth was transferred at that moment. And so, for me, that was always a great story because the Monkees were, I think they're an iconic group. Everybody talks about the Monkees. Everybody talks about, what they were. And at the time, my father was really a songwriter and a producer, and he was always willing to go into the room, try anything. He worked with a lot of great artists, a lot of great songwriters. And one of the things that meant a lot to me when he passed away, he died in 2005, was when I would meet people in the industry. As a young lawyer, they would say to me, and they always had a story. I'd say my father was Jack Keller. They'd be like, "Oh my God, your father was so helpful to me when I was starting out." The guy who wrote the football music, like the da 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 da. This guy, he said, I remember when I was in the mid '70s in ASCAP, I was a songwriter that nobody knew. I had nothing to garner anyone's interest. I asked ASCAP if I could get any help, and they said, "Well, we'll give you connection with like 5 songwriters." So he said, I called 5 of them. 4 of them didn't call me back. And your father was one of them. He called me and he met with me multiple times. He helped me. He gave me advice. He made connections for me. And I feel like I wouldn't have been able to be as successful without him. I've met producers in this town who were like the tape boy at what they used to call the tape boy. Was the guy who made all the copies of the cassette tapes of the music and demos. And so they worked in the tape room. Not a glorious job, and a lot of people overlooked that person. A lot of people treated them poorly. This particular tape boy became one of the top producers in Nashville. And when I met him, he's like, "When I was working at EMI in the tape room, your father was amazing. He would stop and talk to me. He would ask me how I was doing. He would give me advice. He never treated another person as though they were beneath him." And I always felt like that was such a great calling card for him, because he could have easily been very standoffish with people and not treat them with that kindness. So I always feel like it was one of the great things to know that he was not only a very successful songwriter, but a very generous person with his time and energy in helping other people. He believed in teaching. He worked for the Nashville Songwriter Association later in life, teaching songwriting classes. He has always been available to help people. A couple of other stories just that come to mind. Back when he was first starting out, he discovered Tony Orlando. He took him into his apartment, helped him get started in the business, and produced his first album before dawn, and was very much involved in development. Barry Mann, who was one of the great rock and roll writers as well, wanted to be a songwriter in the Brill Building and couldn't get hired. And my father found him, helped him, discovered him, brought him in, got him signed to his first contract with Don Kirshner. which, by the way, at that time, if you were getting $50 a week, that was like you didn't have to work a second job anymore. But that was like a great songwriter advanced salary. He he worked with the Everly Brothers, and my mom always talks about they would come over for dinner, and it was just a different relationship with the songwriters and the artists back then. One of my father's great successes that was always very excited about was when Frank Sinatra cut one of his songs, a song called "When Somebody Loves You." It was one of those big moments in his life, and he sort of had a list of people that he always wanted to cut from. And Perry Como early on, Nat King Cole, that was a great moment for him. But the Frank Sinatra was, hearing Frank Sinatra singing your song was always a great sense of pride for him. He was very happy that he could add that to the list. One of his bigger hits in the 70s called "Easy Come, Easy Go," Bobby Sherman. A lot of people know that. A funny story about how the music industry works that I always tell my clients. The thing about a song is you never know. It could be something that was earning nothing for years and then suddenly become the biggest song somewhere. And it had nothing to do with anything other than timing or luck. So my father had a song called "One Way Ticket to the Blues." Neil Sedaka recorded it. It was the B-side to "Oh Carol." There was a running joke in New York at the Brill Building that amongst all the writers that because my father had so many B-sides. And back then, a B-side paid the same amount as the A-side, because when you bought a 45, there was no way to know which side you were buying. So for my father, he made a lot of royalties on being a B-side. But he had so many B-sides that there was a running joke by the writers that when they finally went to the other side of the moon and were able to see it for the first time, they'd find a Jack Keller song. So this song came out. It was "Oh Carol" was the hit. "One Way Ticket" was not. It had some success in Japan, which was funny, and just went away. 20 years later, in 1979, Howie Greenfield was in Europe, and he traveling around. And he called my father, pre-internet days, so my father was not aware of this, and he said, "Hey, didn't you write a song called 'One Way Ticket to the Blues' back in 1959? He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "I'm hearing it on the radio with this disco group called Eruption." He's like, "What?" He goes, "I'm telling you, it's all over the place." So my father got in his car, drove to the bookstore, bought a Billboard magazine, came home, opened it up, hits of the world. Israel, #1, Germany, #1, Russia, #1, Sweden, #1, Italy, #1. He had no idea. Nobody called him. Nobody told you. And so this song that was not anything in 1959, Eruption said they were in a record store in Germany, and just found the song, listened to it, and thought this would be a fun song to remake. And that totally changed fortunes for him at a time when the industry was a little more difficult for things that were going on for him. And so suddenly this song became, it's funny, his catalog, the song would have been at the bottom of the catalog, and now it's like #2 or 3 in in an earning song. So it's a very interesting thing how the music industry works. And in 1984, moved to Nashville because he felt like the music industry had moved from New York to LA to Nashville, and he needed to be here. So he came to Nashville and began writing at the EMI office here. Charlie Feldman was running the office at the time, who now heads up the EMI, or did. And so he was established in Nashville and wrote here through the 90s and until he never really retired. One of the other funny stories is Charles Koppelman, who people know from the industry as one of the entrepreneurs, business people who bought and sold catalogs, bought EMI with this SBK company. He was a songwriter back in the day, and the early rock and roll days, and his partner Don Rubin, they would write together, and the songs weren't very good. Some of the titles are pretty funny, but my father noticed this and felt like they really weren't going to make it as songwriters, and they were getting married, and he felt like, ugh. So he went to Don Kirshner and said, "I know you're looking for a song plugger. How much you paying a week?" He told him. He said, "These two guys, they'll work for you. Split it. Pay them each half." And so he changed Charlie Koppelman's career to be a business person versus songwriter. And when they bought SBK Body EMI, I remember him seeing my father and giving him, embracing him in a hug. But it was this journey of all these people that you come across in the business. And Charles Koppelman's son is a works as a music supervisor for so many shows, very talented. And in Billions, he placed one of my father's songs in one of their seasons. Downtown placed the song through him, and it was just a great moment of full circle of having that happen. So my relationship with Downtown goes back, 15 years, and I remember when Justin Kalifowitz and I first met, and I loved his story of his father with a record store and how he was part of the music growing up, and I just connected with him right away. And at that point, it was funny. Downtown signed a client of mine, but it was at the time where you just had your UK office. I remember this because the contracts were UK law. It was all UK. There was no real, and I remember that contract because he was a songwriter, wrote liturgical music, and he was signed. And so I was one of the first, Downtown writer signings. But then a couple years later, I started signing some of my my writer clients in the U.S. and built this relationship. And I loved the fact that you had this sort of administration-based company where you could do publishing or administration, because a lot of times when you park stuff for administration, nothing happens. And they had this business model that they could do this. And I remember having these great calls, and I love the staff. And it's funny, we noted this week when we were all together for Music Biz Week, is I really enjoy everybody in the Downtown system, from the neighboring rights folks. I just really enjoy them. The publishing group has been near and dear. I love that the relationship we have, the ability to reach people, to really dig into the numbers and get reports and just feel like the transparency's there, and I don't have to go through a million layers to be able to get the information I need. And now the label services, which has existed, but now that I'm being exposed to that, I feel like all of these departments are filled with great people, and I just really have had so many great experiences that I'm often telling people, like, Downtown is usually where I would place a songwriter for publishing or for administration, and now I know it's an administration services company. And I'm excited to explore the recorded music side, and on neighboring rights, which I think is one of those things that I discovered early enough that I was able to benefit a lot of my clients who were recording music outside the U.S. It's just a great group, and I love being able to reach out to the group over there and just be able to say, hey, is a song recorded in Malaysia going to count, because my client's in Malaysia and he wants to go in the studio today, and I'll get the answer right away. And so they're an educated group of people, very knowledgeable, very friendly. The sync department, Rachel over there, she and I she's always accessible when I want to pitch a song to her or share a new catalog. So I'm really, it's one of the few times where I know a majority of the people at the company and have great experiences with them, and don't just have one person, oh, I have a guy at whatever, and if he's gone, that's that. This is, 15, 20 people that I deal with on a regular basis, from business affairs to A&R to licensing and royalties to neighboring rights and all of those. So it's been a great experience. I really enjoy working with that team, and I'm really glad that they're stewarding this catalog of my father's now.